2024, and let us gather together and experience the goodness of God. I'm Pastor Trey Comstock. We will begin with our scripture of the week, 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 34, through chapter 16, verse 13, and a piece by me entitled, Son of Jesse. Then Pastor Emily Larson and I will talk scripture, and more specifically, what we should be looking for in people versus what we often do look for in people. But first, a reading from 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 34, through chapter 16, verse 13. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gilboa of Saul. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. But Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord was sorry that he had made Saul king over Israel. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you, and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I name to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded, and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came out to meet him, trembling, and said, "Do you come peacefully?" He said, "Peaceably I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves, and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons, and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab, and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance, or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinab, and made him pass before Samuel. He said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." He sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. Scene 1. The upscale reception hall of an ancient home with a door down left. Painted on the walls are important moments in the family's history. Naomi and Ruth setting out and leaving Moab. Ruth entering the threshing barn. Ruth's marriage to Boaz. The birth of Obed. A shepherd's crook and sling hang on the hooks by the door. Lights up. The older brothers and Jesse stand in a huddle upright. They talk with hurried agitation. Jesse's face is visible to the audience. He shows the most concern of all, gesturing at each brother in turn as if handing out instructions for battle. David, visibly younger and more carefree than the others, wanders in through the door. He stands regarding Jesse and the older brothers for a beat, and then crosses to the huddle, trying to get a word in edgewise. David. "Father!" David tries to push his way into the huddle and gets pushed away. David. "Father?" David tries to push into the huddle again and gets pushed back again. David, growing frustrated, "Father!" David tries to push his way into the circle with more force and gets rebuffed with more force, pushing him to the ground and sliding some distance across the floor. Jesse leaves the huddle and crosses to David. David stands up and looks at Jesse. Jesse, exasperated. David. "The prophet Samuel has arrived in Bethlehem and desires to meet with me and your brothers. We must prepare." David. "Can I come? I'm your son too. Maybe he wants to meet all of us." Jesse, with finality. "The prophet is a serious and powerful man. What would he want with a petulant and music-obsessed child?" Jesse immediately rejoins the huddle without another glance at David. David, hurt. I guess I'll go and tend the sheep then. Jesse and the brothers do not respond. David begins to cross to the door. When he's gone a couple of steps, heavy knocking is heard. Herald, from offstage. The prophet of the Lord, Samuel, requests the presence of Jesse and the sons of Jesse at a sacrifice. Jesse and the brothers exchange glances and, with the feeling of a battalion marching into battle, begin to exit in single file, with Jesse at the head. They nervously fidget, straightening their garments as they go. David tries to join the end of the line. He gets pushed away, falling to the floor. He stands back up. The door gets slammed in his face. David stands staring at the door for a beat, and then grabs the shepherd's crook and sling off the wall, opens the door, and exits. Blackout. Scene 2. Rocky Hill Country, outdoors. Sheep scattered in a loose group around rocky outcroppings. A larger boulder sits at center. A lone olive tree, growing out of the boulder with visible roots, sits down left. Lights up, bright. David enters upright. He walks to each sheep in turn. Hello. Good morning. How is your leg this morning? Were you trying to eat those thorns again? You know how well that went last time. No, I don't care that he's mean. You can't eat his head. After checking on each sheep, David crosses to the boulder at center, climbs up on it, sets down his crook and sling, and flops over, sighing. He sits back up, fumbles around for a rock, loads it into his sling, spins it above his head, taking aim at the olive tree, lets it fly, and hits the tree with an audible knock. David. I am a son of Jesse too. Why can't I meet the prophet? It seems like a lot of fuss, and they look kind of scared. Samuel's this big, powerful guy. I know I'm a kid. My brothers are bigger and stronger. They don't sneak into the courtyard to play the liar. But it's not fair. David picks up another rock, loads it into the sling, swings it above his head, lets it fly, and hits the tree with an audible knock. David, confused. I keep feeling like I'm supposed to be there, though. This thing in my head keeps saying, David, you need to talk to Samuel. There's something important that I'm supposed to do? And talking to Samuel will help me figure out what that is, I think. He's the prophet of the Lord. If anyone can explain this, it's him. Right? Looks around at the silent sheep, loses confidence. I'm losing my mind, aren't I? David picks up another rock, loads it into the sling, and begins to swing it above his head. Still swinging, he glances up suddenly, upright. He stops swinging and stands up on the boulder, holding the sling by his side. He holds that pose for a beat, looking increasingly bewildered. David. Why is the herald coming this way? Why is father chasing after the herald? He never comes up here. I didn't even know that he knew how to run. The herald enters upright, crosses halfway to the boulder, and takes a deep breath. Just before he begins to speak, Jesse enters upright, out of breath. Herald. David, son of Jesse, the prophet of the Lord, Samuel, requests your presence. Jesse, panting, undignified. You must come now. Make yourself presentable. You're the last chance. God didn't choose any of your brothers. David continues to stand on the boulder, holding the sling for a beat. He breaks the pose, picks up his crook, attempts to smooth his hair, and begins to exit. Jesse puts his arm around his shoulders, tries to smooth his hair, and they exit together. The herald exits behind them with a dignified grace. Blackout. So, as you just heard in the piece, this is, every once in a while, and apparently a lot in the past month, I am just leaning fully into, I am Trey Comstock, and I went to art school, and some of it is, with this one in particular, this is one of those stories where some of the message is in the text. And so to find other shades of meaning on it, you have to pull harder. It's a story that we know well. Any story that shows up in medieval art is a pretty good sign that this is just a story that we know. Mm-hmm. And some of it is the obvious of David is not like other kings. And so in the way that like Saul looked really kingly, all of his kingly looking brothers are not the king themselves. It's David, this musical, good looking young person. And what matters is he's anointed by the Spirit and he's a king after God's own heart, right? That's the whole, like, the thesis statement of David is not a perfect guy, not always the most kingly looking dude, although he does grow into that. It is what matters is he's a king after God's own heart. And so what I wanted to tease out in the pair of scenes that I wrote of, this kind of almost comedic scene of David trying to break into this conversation and getting utterly rejected. Mm-hmm. And then, David talking to himself is try to get the piece that we don't get, right? We get the family's expectation. We actually get a lot of Samuel's mentality,
yes,
right? Of Samuel is depressed that Saul didn't work out. God's like, get over it, dude.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't work out. I knew we were going to regret this. And guess what?
We did.
We regret this, don't we? Yes, we do. Right. Like, literally, like, it states like God specifically regrets all of this.
Right.
So there's that piece. And we get some of, like, you can feel, even if you don't get, like, a lot of dialogue from Jesse, you get that sense of, like, he has arrayed all the sons but one. And so I wanted to think about, like, why all the sons but one? Why isn't David there? The story already has some dramatic tension. What's going on with that? And so kind of staging David as, and the text kind of does this too, of, like, much younger than the other guys. And then what's going on in David's head? Mm-hmm. Like, what is it to be, like, David had to have known, in my mind, I assume, David had to have known this thing was happening and that he wasn't included.
Right.
And then as he's portrayed as someone with a particularly strong connection to God. And so what's going on in his head is like a God-aware kid of, well, I know I'm supposed, like, so that's where I built that, like, I feel like but like, what would a kid wouldn't have this language, like, it's not Simba, I just can't wait to be king. Well, that's a little bit of Simba, I just can't wait to be king. There is shades of, and maybe it's because The Lion King is on repeat in my household right now, and that's where this comes from, this vision of, like, David as, disaffected Simba, like, oh man, what's going on? They always kick me out of stuff. This may be, the more I think about this, the more inspired by The Lion King that this scene is, which I understand is Hamlet, not the Bible, but anyways, so. But like what, like he had, I choose that he had some sense that, like, there's something different. There's something special. There's something, like, I feel like I'm supposed to do something and I feel like I'm not being allowed to do it. And that feels really strange. And so I'm going to go do, mildly symbolic things where I have him, flop down on a rock and he's, try to build in like useful, like, David objects, right? So the sling ends up being this, important, and he's, swinging it at this tree. So this is the root of Jesse, like, with visible roots, the root of Jesse's tree. And so this may get fleshed out into a play someday. But like, and then the utter shock of, oh my gosh, this is happening. And via the person of the herald. And then we get this, Jesse, the way the story's written, Jesse doesn't go get David. He sends somebody. Mm-hmm. But I liked that image pulling from the parable of the prodigal son. So one of the big deals in the parable of the prodigal son is that the dad runs. No, we've talked about this before, but like no biblical era head of the household was going to run anywhere. It was undignified, mm-hmm. right? Dignity and honor was like a really big deal. So the concept of Jesse running, it's like Samuel says, go send for him. And we get, he was brought. We never get like Jesse went.
Right.
And odds are Jesse didn't really go, but that just, I liked the image of like,
it is a very
Jesse showing
dramatic pause that like, there's very much a moment where Samuel's like, nobody's sitting down. We're not done here. Like the main guy's not here yet.
Yes,
like, we're not sitting down till he's here. So it is a very dramatic space.
Like, hey, well, and there is this isn't explicit. And so, maybe I'm right about this, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I get the sense that Samuel is kind of ticked at Jesse. I've always felt that Samuel is kind of upset at Jesse in this moment of like, so God sent me here to anoint the king from among your sons. Mm-hmm. And that, like, why are they not all here? Like, why are, like, if there's a villain of this story, it's Jesse, right? You know, or Saul, but Jesse.
Yeah.
Of, like, you had, like, I called for you know, and I try to play up having a herald. That's a medieval concept, right? Like, just, but it played for the dramatic of what I was trying to do.
Right.
Of, like, this person who's like, this man who is a big deal wants to do big deal things.
Right.
This man who is a big deal asked for your sons and didn't specify the ones you thought were worthy. And so I wanted to, like, also capture some of, but with only showing scenes not in the Bible, I wanted to show some of Jesse's emotional state of essentially getting called out by the prophet.
Right.
And because it's essentially what happens. And so that's why he shows up sprinting in scene 2.
Right. To
give him that moment of undignity, to give him that moment of, oh, I messed this up.
Right.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So it was trying to tease out the, like, character dynamics as much as we can tell, and to give a little bit of voice, because David has, like, no lines.
None.
David's the star of the show, and he has no lines.
Yep.
And to give him lines of what does it feel like to be excluded, and then what does it feel like to get excluded while feeling like, oh, I'm supposed to be doing something, and I feel like I can't do that thing. And to, again, center that on God's ideas of kingship versus our ideas of kingship, which has been kind of what we've been discussing for 2-3 weeks now.
Yes.
Of, like, this is different, right? Like, God's standards for us, God's standards for leaders, God's standards are, this whole series and called Divinely Countercultural, right? Are inherently countercultural. And here is this countercultural picture of what God's interested in, is this, like, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-old, however he feels, very young guy who feels called, like, who feels something. And he must have felt things being excluded from that conversation. Absolutely.
And just the fact that even his own immediate family didn't even bother to let him show up to the kingship audition, right, is what you called it, is he didn't get to even show up, but to feel called, or for Samuel to go, he's not here yet, and then as soon as he walks in, yes, this is the one, right? This is a very big deal.
Yeah, that's the guy.
But it just emphasizes so much of, I mean, this is not the first time that suitability has been picked over seniority, right? This happens all the time in Scripture. This is Joseph over his older brothers. This is, Abel and Cain. This is
essentially Jacob over Esau, right?
Isaac and Ishmael, right? Like, there's
in a sneaky kind of way.
So it's definitely a suitability thing.
Well, and that God, like, we keep, and this comes up in, like, a lot of very strange theological discussions where we forget that the Bible is so often challenging the rules of the ancient world.
Yes.
Right? That sometimes the Bible talks about and interacts with the rules of the ancient world. But sometimes, like, even as it talks about them and recognizes that they're a reality, the Bible then also challenges them in major ways. This is, in the setting the scene, I have painted on the walls of Jesse's house is Naomi and Ruth.
Yes.
Like, this is a really big deal because Ruth is a Moabite woman.
Right.
Ruth is a Moabite woman.
In Jesse's family tree.
Is directly... Mm-hmm. In Jesse's, like, directly above Jesse, in Jesse's family tree.
Yes.
Right? Jesse is, it is David, son of Jesse, Jesse, son of Obed, right? Like, we are not that far removed from Ruth and Boaz here.
Yes.
Like, this just happened.
Yes.
This is presumably in living memory.
Yes.
Of this Moabite woman, and then the prophet shows up at the house of the family descended essentially from the Moabite woman to select the king.
Yep.
So again, already Jesse's family shouldn't be suitable. They are not so pure, right? They are not
the stuff of royal lineage.
Traced all the way back.
Right. Exactly.
Right. They are not. Mm-hmm. And so even even it being Jesse's family, which we just take for granted in this part of the text, is itself futzing with the normal rules, right? Or just like, Jacob and Esau, right? It is the big brawny brother versus the clever brother. And it is the clever brother who, we'll go with, ends up with it. The clever, mildly amoral brother is the one who ends up with it.
Yep.
Like we're often playing with, like, there are these rules, there are these inheritance rules, there are these rules about who are the right kind of people and who are the wrong kind of people. And so often what is happening in not just in Genesis, but certainly in Genesis, happening in Exodus, right? Moses is a murderer. Like, we bring this up a lot, right? Like, Moses killed a guy. And Moses was raised in Pharaoh's household. And so Moses is this like, and then like runs away and chills with the priest of Midian.
Right.
So like Moses is this oddball, in a real way, like an oddball pick to be the founding leader of God's people. Moses, the murderer, the raised by the Egyptians, not by God's people, born of God's people, but not raised by them. And then chills with and takes a wife from a priest of Midian. Right. Like, this is not a good sign, but with Moses, it's the right fit.
Yes.
Like, who else could talk to Pharaoh in the way that he does, but then also be able to lead God's people in the way that, like, and so you pick the oddball, not the by suitability standards, it's Aaron, not Moses.
Right.
And Moses is the one who drafts Aaron when God's, it's like, hey, I need help. Okay, fine. You also have your brother Aaron, but your brother Aaron's not the dude. You're the dude.
You're the dude.
But these are all challenges to the standard thinking of ancient culture, not carrying forward the standard thinking of ancient culture.
Yes, and this is,
how we often get the dudes.
Yeah, but this is Jesus eating with sinners. This is, anytime the marginalized, the poor, the outcast, the one that doesn't quite fit in, the youngest, the eighth son, right? David is the eighth son. He's the youngest.
Right.
He should not be put to the forefront. But God's upside down kingdom, the way that God views things is different than the way that we view things, right? It is countercultural. It is divinely countercultural. And so the challenge then is to look with God's eyes, not ours, right? See what God sees, not what we should.
We talked about this, I try to talk about this as often as I can when we talk about Christmas, when we talk about the birth of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so you probably heard this from me 6 months ago, but like, why is Jesus born of a carpenter?
Right.
Right? Like, why is this the household? Why? Because we're all within a 5-mile radius of the Herodian, Herod's seat of power, and the temple. All are like, you can see from the, Bethlehem's on like a hilltop. And so from this hilltop of Bethlehem, you can see in one direction is the Herodian, very visible. I walked from Bethlehem to the Herodian, and then the Israeli Defense Force showed up and was very upset about that. Choices were made, but I have walked from Bethlehem to the Herodian. It is a doable walk. I have then walked back after a Hummer showed up. And then, the temple is in full view of Bethlehem as well, right? It is, we're right there. And so why wasn't Jesus born in the house of Herod? Why wasn't Jesus born, these are not celibate priests, right? They have families. The celibate priesthood's way down the road. These are not celibate priests. These priests have families. Why isn't Jesus born of Caiaphas? Why isn't Jesus born of Herod? Why is Jesus the, son of an, barely wed mother, and, the adopted son of a carpenter, right? Like, that also gets at this, like, we time and time again, we see the counterintuitive, countercultural nature of God's selection process versus our selection process. No one looking at the landscape of, first century Judea would have even heard of, the traveling rabbi son, we've talked about this before, the traveling rabbi son of, adopted son of a carpenter. No one's heard of him. No one's heard of Joseph. Who's Joseph? Joseph's just like, he's a good guy, clearly, famously, like a good guy, like a righteous man. But, righteousness seldom brings you fame. And He's just a dude. He's just a dude, but like a really good dude. But like he is like any of our dads, right? Like any of our dads who were just dudes, right? Who were maybe dudes who work with numbers, or dudes who work with their hands, or dudes who whatever. Like you know, if you had like a dad that was like good but was like just a dude, that's Joseph. Jesus had the same earthly dad that you did. Happy Father's Day, everybody. Like Jesus, like I don't actually, I'm actually complimenting, not slagging Joseph, right? Like he's like Jesus is, you know, born of Mary, who's just a lady, right? And Joseph, who's just a dude. It's same cycle of, and then Jesus travels the countryside and picks a whole bunch of dudes, just a dude. Like before Jesus picked him, no one outside of the Capernaum community had heard of Peter. No one had heard of him. Like, it's just like a good fisherman who, you know, had a mother-in-law, so presumably cared for his family, and was, you know, respected by his father enough to have the family business, you know, passed on to him, right? Like, that was Peter. Peter was just like a solid dude. Dude with flaws. We're all of us who are dudes with flaws. Dude with flaws, but like, no one is looking at, again, no one's looking at the landscape of first century Galilee and Judea and going, that Peter, that you know, Cephas there in Capernaum, he's going to go far. They looked at him and went, that Cephas, you know, his town went, oh, I'm really glad that he's going to inherit his father's business because we're going to have fish to eat. Like that was probably the extent of it. And then he becomes, you know, if you've ever been to St. Peter's Basilica or seen pictures of it, there's this like giant, like just colossal church built on the spot where he's buried. That is not where he started, friends. Preached this sermon on this text before where I showed pictures of like, can you choose between pastor, newscaster, and used car salesman, right? Like that we have this like image of like, these are like respect. I had like, I literally like, I would show a picture and like, is this person a pastor, a newscaster, or something? I don't remember if it was a car sales, but like I had 3 categories and you had to guess. And like every once in a while, like one guy was both, but it was like all the same, like slightly balding, you know, 30 pounds overweight, in a suit that only kind of fits, white guy, right? Like, you know, 50-plus-year-old white guy. Like that was the image. And that's what we want in newscasters. And that's what we want in pastors. And, you know, and I live the life of like, happen to be one of the, you know, both you and I live the life of like, you're the pastor. Yeah, we are. Deal with it. Right. And so, you know, I was in my feelings, about that. That may have been right after that specific incident that I am doing an impression of, when I wrote that piece. Look, every once in a while it shows up, but like, we have these images of, you know, like, not to be political, but like we have one man who just turned 78 this week and a guy who's going to be over 80. And those are your 2 presidential options. One of the things that's been interesting for me in the like the newer, kinder, gentler United Methodist Church that gives me hope is the people we are centering now, and this strays into the other show, I guess, but like the people we are centering now are not the people we used to center. I see a lot more voices under 40. I see a lot more voices who don't share any demographic category with me other than human, right? So I'm a 30-something, but I am a white dude. And I'm a white dude with a certain level of education, which is mildly too much. And so it is fascinating to me when we see less centering on, like, you know, certainly, you know, 50-year or older, you know, mildly overweight, white dude in a specific kind of suit, right? Which is like the box that we have drawn, that we culturally have drawn for this is what the power and respectability looks like. And I want to, like, and I don't mean this to be, I mean this to be mildly political, in that like we should always bring a biblical lens to our politics. And maybe that means your choices, by the way, are for a presidential election this year are for, you know, 2 white guys of a certain age, one of one body type and one of another. But that's physically about the only difference. But like to unpack when we look at somebody, why do we think that person is leadership material? Is it because we are sensing that divine spark? Or is it because they look like David's brothers, they look like Saul, all of which looked like a great, Saul was like a, strapping, powerful guy. He looked like, Saul looked like a king. Turned out to be a terrible one. David's brothers looked kingly, right? Especially for the first couple, which get highlighted. It's like, you've got to be. No, I'm getting it. This just in. It's not you. I'm as shocked as you are. It's not you. Maybe, well, it's not you either. You gotta remember that. You gotta sense like the flop sweats from Samuel of like, it's not. I agree. Especially when we got to the last guy and he doesn't know there's another kid. Like you just because like Saul's got Samuel out on a limb, right? Like Samuel could very much get killed for this, and like it's not even working. Like God led me to the house of Jesse. It's just God. What are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? Oh, Jesse forgot a kid? Oh, Jesse, you're gonna get that guy, and we're not gonna sit down until he gets here. You don't put the strain on the prophet, man. In a model of ancient kingship, you're probably not looking for like the kind-eyed kid. You're looking for the strapping, because part of, and this is where, the kind of scene I allude to in the piece that he's going to take down Goliath, right? Like this scene of him standing on a boulder holding the sling. Like, I wanted that image in your mind because one of the things that a king or like is supposed to do is they're supposed to be a single combat, your nation's single combat warrior. Like that is one of the things you're looking for in a king is to be your single combat warrior or to be able to lead single combat warriors. But potentially, like, there were real we read it in the Iliad, right? Of like, where you send forth your single combat warrior against their single, Hector versus Achilles, right? You got to realize like the Iliad is kind of a contemporaneous text to where we are, right? We are in line, similar time period as the Iliad. And so you have this expectation that your king is going to be your single combat warrior. Saul doesn't end up being your single combat warrior. Who ends up being your single combat warrior? The ruddy kid, while he's still a ruddy kid, takes the slingshot and decks the giant Goliath. And so even with that scene, and I don't think that is not in this series, so I'm not spoiling, I'm not burning podcasts for another week. You see that David is even able to do the like big burly kingly things because what matters is that God's on his side, that he's got a heart after God, that he is able to answer God's call. Like, I'll go. Oh, do you want the armor? Nah, no, I'm good. Just send me out there. I'm going to be fine. And he is fine. And he decks Goliath as a child. Let's not do too much in the child soldier bit, but like as a child working as a soldier, he does it, right? Like he is able to do the strong parts of kingship, at least as good as Saul. Saul should have been the one out there facing Goliath, not David. Yet it is David, and well done, David. But he is able to do those things, not because he looks right, because even then he doesn't look right. It is because of all the things that God both sees in him, and then, we get the Spirit of the Lord anoints him, right? Like God puts in him. This is God equipping the called, not calling the equipped. David is wildly unequipped. So is Saul. But like David is at least as unequipped for kingship as Saul is. David consistently, even when he gets it wrong, is able to find God. And Saul doesn't. Like that, if we want to draw one of those through lines across the Testaments, across the Bible, it is unusual people end up doing the things that God really needs done. This is part of what's told in the story of Jesus's, both of Jesus's genealogies, right? This is where Ruth shows up, right? Because Ruth has to. In a version, Rahab shows up. Rahab, a sex worker, right? And a not of God's people shows up, right? Like it is over and over and over again, it is the oddball. It is the unusual choice. It is the choice that no one else would make. that God sees the thing that God needs, and that God puts in even more into all of us, whether we look like as is expected or not. And that is part of the biblical story of what God is looking for. And when we are making those kind of choices of who belongs, of who's important, the prayer, is that we see it with God's eyes and not just our, oh, that looks like what I expect. I will pick that. If you have your own stories of this, of unlikely leaders doing amazing things, email us, thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. That is thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. If you want more of what we're doing, weird as our schedule is right now, it's at Servants Now on just about all the things. Facebook.com/ServantsNow, YouTube.com/ServantsNow, TikTok and Instagram at ServantsNow, and ServantsNow.org on the internet. Everything we do here in the Media Lab is made possible by a generous Innovators Grant for the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. If you would like to support this show, like, comment, subscribe, share, leave us 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. All of that helps us be more sustainable. And go in peace. Love and serve the Lord. And we'll see you next time.